They thought it was just a convoy, slow exposed and helpless. But in that steel shell were 100,000 lives, and the death of one Exodus would become the birth of a war like no other. The Exodus drifted through the void, massive, slow, and utterly exposed. It was no warship, no fortress, just a desperate Exodus, sealed in steel, carrying 100,000 souls toward the fragile hope of safety. Humans and their alien allies crammed into stasis pods and makeshift quarters, escaping the war that had already burned too many worlds on the bridge. Commander Wren watched the swirling patterns of distant nebulae from the observation deck, his reflection barely visible in the reinforced viewport. Beside him, Lieutenant Lyra monitored the navigation system, her eyes fixed on the shifting holographic projections. "Trajectory is holding steady," Lyra reported. "Still, another 14 hours before we reach Delta 5. Wren nodded, arms crossed. "Anything on sensors, nothing unusual," Lyra said. "Just us, the escort, and the empty space." Outside, flanking the Exodus, a small escort fleet kept pace, two frigates and a handful of fighter squadrons, the bare minimum for defense. It was a quiet stretch of space, far from active battle zones. No reason to expect trouble. Then the void screamed. A piercing alarm tore through the bridge. Red strobes flashing across the control panels. Lyra snapped her head toward the displays. Mass signatures detected. Wren lunged forward, eyes locking onto the screen. A dozen unknown contacts surged out of the void, their arrival marked by the brief, eerie shimmer of ships transitioning from faster-than-light travel. No approach signal, no hails, just warships bristling with heavy cannons, forming an unbreakable wall between the refugees and safety. Lyra's voice was tight, controlled. "They just cut off our trajectory. We're boxed in." The command console flared again. Another warning. Communications jammed. Wren growled. "They're cutting us off." Across the Exodus, crew members scrambled. Pilots rushed to their stations. Security teams reinforced key sectors. Engineers rerouted power to shields. The entire ship, a city in motion, now held its breath. Then the first message arrived. A harsh, guttural transmission crackling through forced entry into their comms. "Refugee vessel, your journey ends here." "No one leaves," Wren stiffened. The voice was alien, heavy with contempt. His hands curled into fists. "Who is this?" he barked. A moment of silence. Then another voice. Deeper. Cold. "We are the reckoning for your arrogance." Wren knew what this was. Retaliation. Before he could reply, a second set of alarms screamed across the bridge. "Energy spikes." Lyra shouted, "They're charging weapons. Send a distress call." Wren snapped, "Trying." Lyra replied. A pause. A flicker of hesitation. Then her voice dropped, heavy with unease. "Signals not getting through." Wren turned sharply toward her. "Try a different channel." "I'm trying everything." Lyra's face paled as she ran through emergency frequencies, military encryptions, open bands, nothing. "They're blocking all outbound transmissions. No one outside this system is hearing us." Silence hung for a fraction of a second before Wren muttered, "Damn it." No help was coming. Before the words left his mouth, space burned. A volley of plasma lanced across the void, striking Escort 3, the rearguard of the convoy. The frigate's shields flared, white-hot, buckled, and shattered. A fraction of a second later, the ship itself followed, torn apart in an instant, its core imploding in a blinding shockwave that rocked the Exodus. "What the hell? Where did they come from?" One pilot shouted over the comms. "Doesn't matter. Form up and fire. Fire. Fire." came the voice of Captain Dax, commander of Escort 1. Cut them down before they get another shot. The remaining 2 frigates surged forward, their thrusters burning hot. They deployed countermeasures, chaff dispersal, ECM pulses, disrupting enemy targeting for precious seconds. 12 fighter squadrons broke formation in a coordinated counter-offensive engines, screaming as they weaved through incoming fire. They weren't just trying to protect the Exodus. They were going to kill as many of the bastards as they could. The first wave of attackers, 13 ships, sleek and predatory, had expected a slaughter, and they would get one. But first, the humans would make them bleed. Hit whatever's in front of you. Just give them something to think about. Dax commanded. The frigate's railguns thundered, tearing through enemy shields. One of the alien warships, a mid-sized raider, its hull black and jagged, shuddered as a tungsten round ripped through its reactor core. It detonated in a brilliant flash, debris scattering in all directions. The fighters struck next, strafing in synchronized runs. Laser fire punctured another enemy ship's thrusters, sending it spiraling into a collision course with its own formation. Within 90 seconds, 3 enemy ships had been obliterated. 2 more were heavily damaged. On the bridge of the Exodus, Lyra's voice rang out in disbelief. They're actually pushing them back. Ren allowed himself a brief smile. The sensors screamed. Second wave inbound, someone shouted. Before Dax could even turn his head, the void exploded. A cascade of enemy warships, about 20 of them, erupted from hyperspace weapons already primed. There was no pause, no time to react. The second wave didn't arrive to reinforce. It arrived to finish what the first had started. Dax saw them first. All units form up. He barked. We hold the line. Buy time for the Exodus to break free. The frigates reoriented shields at maximum. The fighters reloaded, preparing another attack run. The enemy did not wait. Escort 1, still holding formation, was the first to be obliterated. A single command echoed through the Exodus. His bridge speakers: erase them, then fire. A storm of plasma cannons and hypervelocity rounds descended upon the escort fleet. Shields, failed hulls ruptured. The Exodus trembled as shockwaves battered its frame. Dax's frigate. Escort 1 took the brunt of the assault. Its bow split apart, atmosphere venting into the void as the ship buckled inward. But even as it died, it fired one last volley, 4 missiles streaking toward an enemy cruiser. The detonation tore through the alien warship's bridge, sending it drifting, burning into the dark. Then Escort 1 was gone. The surviving fighters tried to scatter, but they were cut down mid-maneuver, their signatures vanishing from the Exodus's tactical display in rapid succession. It was over. The escort fleet was no more. And now there was nothing between the enemy and the Exodus. Full burn, Ren ordered. Get us out of here. Lyra's hands flew across the console. They're jamming our FTL drive. Reroute power to forward shields. Activate all point defense turrets. Ren ordered. Deploy countermeasures. Give us cover on it. Lyra's hands raced across the controls, punching in commands. Along the hull, automated turrets swiveled to life, spitting out desperate bursts of fire. Chaff clouds erupted from the ship's flanks. Jamming pulses surged through the void, scrambling enemy targeting systems. The bridge vibrated as the countermeasure array overloaded a lock-on attempt from an incoming torpedo, forcing it to detonate prematurely. For a brief moment, the gambit bought them time. A few enemy fighters veered off course. Their targeting scrambled by electronic countermeasures. A torpedo detonated prematurely, its explosion sending a ripple of static through enemy sensors. One raider, struck by a burst from the defensive turrets, lost control, its thrusters misfiring, sending it into a chaotic tumbling rotation before rupturing into a violent cascade of molten debris. Push through. Ren yelled. The Exodus barreled ahead, engines burning at critical levels. They could see the edge of the battlefield, see the darkness beyond their last chance at escape. But unfortunately, it was hopeless. A second transmission came through. This time it wasn't a warning. It was a sentence. Die knowing your people failed you. The first shot slammed into the refugee ship's hull. Shields flared, absorbing the impact. But the second, the third, those broke through. The Exodus buckled under the onslaught, metal shrieking as explosions rippled through its superstructure. Inside, chaos. Hallways ripped apart. Emergency bulkheads slammed shut, sealing off sections in a desperate failing attempt to contain the destruction. Screams filled the comms decks, depressurized bodies. So many bodies were sucked into the void, frozen expressions of terror drifting among the wreckage. Lyra clung to her station, structural failure spreading. "Get the civilians to the escape pods," Ren demanded. Lyra's voice cracked. "There are no pods, sir. This isn't a warship." Ren stopped. There was nothing left. The Exodus shuddered. A final death rattle. Its power core, damaged beyond repair, reached critical levels. In its dying moments, an automated failsafe triggered a last act of defiance. A small black capsule detached from the ship, barely the size of a golf ball. It tumbled silently through the void, too insignificant to be noticed, too advanced to be destroyed. It held everything. The final moments, the last transmissions, the truth, and then silence. The Exodus ceased to be. A blast of white-hot energy engulfed the remains, incinerating what little was left. No debris sizable enough to be found, no survivors, just fading embers of a massacre. The enemy fleet lingered only for a moment, then turned away. Their work done. A transmission sent from the lead warship 100,000. Less of you. Then they vanished, leaving nothing behind. The colony of Delta 5 was no stranger to waiting. The evacuation effort had been chaotic from the start, with convoys departing at staggered intervals under strict security measures. Some ships arrived ahead of schedule. Others trailed behind, delayed by navigation recalibrations or minor technical failures. But never this late. Chief Logistics Officer Raylan sat in the command center of the colony's orbital hub, staring at the blinking indicator on his console. A single vessel remained unaccounted for. The Exodus. Try the frequency again. Headland ordered, his tone sharp with unease. The comm officer, a young technician named Nova, hesitated before pressing the transmission key. Transport Exodus. This is Delta 5. You are overdue by 12 hours. Respond immediately. Only static. Dalla swallowed, glancing at Headland. No response, sir. Headland exhaled slowly. A heavy silence settled over the control deck. Around them, officers exchanged uneasy glances. The refugee ships weren't military vessels. Most didn't even have sophisticated navigation arrays. And this one carried the largest number of lives at once since the beginning of this conflict. Delays happened, but 12 hours without a single transmission. "This isn't right," Headland muttered. "Expand the scan range. Check for emergency beacons, already running a sweep." Another officer reported. No distress signals detected along their route. Headland's stomach twisted. "Alert Earth," he said grimly. "Something's wrong." The alert reached Fleet Command within minutes. Protocol dictated that any missing vessel carrying refugees be escalated immediately. In war, civilians were not just non-combatants. They were political leverage symbols of endurance. A priority meeting was convened aboard the UHS Olympus, a mobile command ship serving as the operational hub for the human-led front. The three Supreme Admirals overseeing the war effort stood gathered around a holographic display of the sector, its vast emptiness, stretching from Delta 5 to the battleground where they had recently claimed victory. Kyle stood motionless, arms crossed, his piercing gaze fixed on the void where the Exodus should have been. Thorn, the youngest of the three, drummed his fingers against the console, his mind already working through possibilities. Vor, the most methodical of them, leaned forward, his brow furrowed. Their last known position was here. A tactical officer pointed to a calculated trajectory marked by an interrupted line ending in nothing. 12 hours overdue. "No signals, no wreckage reports," Kale muttered. "That's not a delay, that's a ghost ship." "We're not ruling out a navigation failure," Thorn offered. "The Exodus wasn't a warship. If their FTL drive failed, they could be stranded in deep space." Vor shook his head. "If they lost FTL, their distress beacon would still be transmitting." "We're not seeing anything." Kyle exhaled sharply. "Then we have to assume the worst." Silence followed. After a moment, Vor straightened. "I'll take a task force and retrace their route." Thorn and Kale exchanged looks before nodding. "Take the Hermes and a recon fleet," Kale ordered. "Find out what the hell happened." Vor gave a sharp nod. "I'll depart within the hour." The Hermes, an advanced fleet command ship, dropped from hyperspace alongside 4 recon frigates and a squadron of stealth drones. On the bridge, Vor stared into the abyss, the emptiness stretching before them. "This is the last confirmed position of the Exodus." The ship's AI reported start scanning for wreckage or anomalous energy signatures. Vor ordered. The drones dispersed, sweeping the area with long-range gravimetric scans. Nothing. Hours passed. The recon ships expanded their search radius, calculating possible drift patterns in case the Exodus had suffered a catastrophic failure mid-flight. Still nothing. Vor clenched his jaw. There should be wreckage. Then a ping. "Admiral," a sensor officer called. "We've got debris, but it's scattered and minimal. Too little for a ship that size." Vor's brow furrowed. "What kind of debris?" "Trace metallic fragments, some plating consistent with escort frigates, but nothing large enough to be a capital-class transport." "That's impossible," muttered Juno Vor's second-in-command. "A ship the size of the Exodus doesn't just disappear, unless it was vaporized," Vor said grimly. The bridge fell silent. A new signal flashed on the scanners. Another contact. Small object drifting alone. Vor's fingers tightened around the console. Magnify. The screen zoomed in. A black capsule, barely the size of a golf ball, drifted in the void. "A data recorder," Rowe whispered. Vor didn't hesitate. "Retrieve it." A drone glided toward the capsule, securing it delicately before ferrying it aboard. Within minutes, the Hermes technicians had it linked to the decryption bay. "Begin playback," Vor ordered. The screen flickered. A fractured feed from the bridge of the Exodus filled the display, marred by static and distortion. Then, send a distress call. Ren's voice raw with urgency, signals not getting through, Lyra's panicked response. The recording jumped, flickering frames, showing explosions tearing through the escort frigates, fighter squadrons disintegrating mid-maneuver, then the enemy's voice. Die knowing your people failed you. Then fire the final moment of the exodus. A blinding detonation screams cut short. A white-hot eruption consuming everything, and then nothing. Silence filled the Hermes bridge. Vor's fingers curled into fists. The officers around him remained frozen, processing the full horror of what they had just witnessed. This wasn't a navigational error. It wasn't an accident. It was a cold-blooded slaughter. Vor turned to his comm officer. His voice was icy. Patch me through to KL and Thorn. Now the room was silent as the recording finished playing. The holographic display flared to life aboard the UHS Olympus. KL's jaw was set in stone, his hands clasped behind his back. Thorn leaned against the edge of the war table, fingers pressed to his temple. On the other end of the transmission, Vor stood unmoving aboard the Hermes, his expression dark. None of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. The footage said everything. That was a massacre. Thorn finally murmured, his voice cold. Not a military engagement, not a strategic move. A premeditated extermination. Kyle finished. Vor's expression was carved from granite, and they wanted us to know. A heavy pause. Then Kyle stood taller, his voice cold. We're done playing games? Thorn nodded. If they think they can break us like this, they're about to learn. Vor growled what real war looks like. The chamber aboard the UHS Olympus was silent. The three most powerful men in the United Human Fleet had just watched 100,000 lives erased in an act of deliberate extermination. Vor leaned forward, hands pressed against the war table, fingers tightening as if gripping the galaxy itself. They wanted to send a message. Kael's eyes darted toward him. Then we send one back. Thorn nodded once. Resolute. No negotiations. Vor didn't hesitate. We make sure they understand. There will be no second chance. Kael turned to the communications officer stationed at the far end of the room. Patch me through. Open a direct line. No encryption, no distortion. I want every relay station and every faction listening. The officer obeyed swiftly, working the controls as he established a connection that would broadcast in every known language, across every major channel in the Coalition's network. Across the stars, their message would be received by diplomats, soldiers, civilians, and most importantly, by the ones who had ordered the massacre. A small green light blinked. The channel was live. Kael straightened. His face was unreadable. His voice smooth as steel. Not loud, not angry, just cold, absolute. This message is for your leaders. We know what you did. Only cowards attack innocent people like this, and we will make sure you never do this again. We're coming for you. The transmission cut. For a moment, nothing happened. Then across the UHS Olympus, alerts began flashing. Reports flooded in. The message spread like wildfire, reaching every military command. Intelligence network and colony, across the Coalition's borders. There was no way to intercept, no way to distort its meaning. Across enemy space, the words echoed, and then the panic began. The Coalition War Council had been deep in session when the transmission reached them. The chamber, a vast domed structure within the core world of Xanthol, had been filled with debates over fleet movements, civilian unrest, and future offensives against humanity. Until now. The message played once, twice a dozen times, looping on every terminal, every encrypted line. "We're coming for you." A heavy silence. Then the room erupted into chaos. How did this transmission even get through our secured networks? One of the diplomats roared. "It doesn't matter." Another snapped. "You heard what they said. We should respond immediately." A military official insisted. "Issue a formal rejection of their accusations." "Are you insane?" Another barked. "They're not looking for a discussion. This is a death sentence." The two most powerful figures in the coalition, the ones who had orchestrated the massacre, remained silent. Counselor Zorik of the Zalari Dominion, a towering multi-limbed creature with pale, iridescent skin and black, pupilless eyes, sat rigid in his chair, staring at nothing. His kind had ruled for millennia, bending weaker species to their will. Yet for the first time in his life he felt something he had never known dread. Beside him, Counselor Rhett of the Cathari Imperium, a reptilian warlord whose species had never feared anything, was motionless, his claws resting against the smooth metal of the table. The message played once more. Rhett's fingers twitched. "They're not bluffing." Zorik exhaled slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, they're not." Rhett's claws tightened against the table, the weight of reality pressing down on him. "We assumed they would flinch, that they would hesitate after we struck their civilians." Zorik's gaze locked toward him. "We assumed wrong. The coalition had planned more attacks. This was supposed to be the first of many. More massacres, more exterminations. If enough civilian casualties piled up, humanity would be forced to retreat, to surrender, to beg for peace. Instead, they had woken a monster. Rhett's claws dug into the table. "We need to leave." Zorik turned his head slowly. "What?" Rhett's slitted eyes locked onto his counterpart. "You heard them. They're coming for us." Murmurs spread through the council chamber. No one had ever seen Rhett, the architect of so many conquests, like this uncertain. "Afraid we stay here. We die," he continued. "The humans will burn their way through our fleets. And by the time they reach this chamber, there won't be a negotiation. There won't be a surrender. There will only be execution." A silence filled the room. He was right. Zorik shifted in his seat, his mind racing. "Then we go to the home systems. We consolidate power, gather every fleet, every available soldier. Make a stand." Rhett exhaled sharply. "No." "We run." Zorik's gaze snapped toward him. Rhett's voice was quiet. "We find somewhere. They can't reach us. If they destroy everything else, we wait. We rebuild." Zorik hesitated. The home systems had the strongest defenses in the coalition. If they fell, their entire empire collapsed. But the humans had already demonstrated something terrifying. They were not bound by the same expectations of war. If they were coming, they would not stop. The War Council continued their arguing. Some refused to believe what was happening. Others were already drafting contingency plans for retreat. Zorik and Rhett remained in their seats. Deep down, they both knew the truth. Humanity had decided their fate, and it was already too late to change it. The war room aboard the UHS Olympus pulsed with quiet intensity, star charts and fleet trajectories humming in the air. Admiral Kale stood at the center, arms crossed, watching as the reality of their response took shape before him. Reports flooded in fleet formations, supply routes, battle group confirmations. Every relay station, every military outpost Every classified stronghold in human-controlled space now knew what had happened, and the answer was unanimous. Humanity was going to war. Kale turned to the command interface, his voice calm but absolute. Order the Perseus Initiative to mobilize and rendezvous with Task Force Epsilon at Relay Point Omega-4. They move first. I want the Ares Armada prepped for full deployment from Sol coordinate with home fleet, but keep their trajectory classified. The Iron Vanguard will serve as our hammer, advancing alongside Sovereign Command toward high-priority targets. Officers scrambled, executing his orders with efficiency. These were not fleets meant for border skirmishes or political posturing. These were war machines, held in reserve for one purpose: decisive annihilation. The Perseus Initiative was a collection of Black Ops strike groups, ships built with experimental technology that no one outside the highest ranks of command had ever seen in action. Ares was an armada, crafted for planetary siege, heavy assault warships designed to tear through orbital defenses with methodical destruction. Iron Vanguard, a relic of a more brutal era, was a fleet spoken of in whispers, its existence long denied its captains. Trained for wars that no one had dared to wage. Now all of them were moving as one. Fleet Command relayed another transmission, intelligence from embedded operatives within the coalition. Kale read the decrypted text and exhaled slowly. They ran. Vor and Thorn turned toward him silent for only a second before Vor spoke. Where Kyle turned the display, revealing a breakdown of planetary movements across coalition space. Their home worlds, they thought they'd be safe. Thorn cracked his knuckles, shaking his head. Not for long. Kyle's fingers moved swiftly across the controls. We split the advance. I stay here and coordinate fleet operations from Olympus. You two lead the first engagement. Vor leaned in his expression carved from ice as he studied the strategic overlay. We divide the force and strike their strongholds simultaneously. We burn every safe haven they think they have. Thorn nodded. If they think they'll have time to consolidate power, they're wrong. Kale's orders were already transmitting. You move in 12 hours. Take what you need. The first strike is ours. Across human space, war engines stirred to life. Massive dry docks released titanic ships. From their berths, entire armadas moving like ghosts through deep space lanes. Tactical strike groups disappeared from sensor grids, shifting to pre-designated dark zones before launching their offensive maneuvers. Every fleet that had ever been rumored in military conspiracy forums. Every secret warship design that skeptics dismissed as human arrogance. Every classified force that had been waiting in the shadows, mobilized. Entire planetary economies shifted overnight as industrial powerhouses fed the war machine. By the time the Coalition's war strategists realized what was happening, it was already too late. Reports reached the Coalition's Inner War Council within hours. Human forces had moved faster than their analysts had believed possible. Panic rippled through the highest echelons of power. The architects of the massacre were now trapped in a waking nightmare. Their military advisors scrambled to provide assessments, their intelligence officers failing to produce anything but speculation. Then came the second report: the humans are not coming to engage. They are coming to end this war. They are bringing fleets that the Coalition had never seen before, their numbers exponentially greater than what the Coalition had accounted for. The first military commander to analyze the data stood in stunned silence before whispering, "This is impossible." Within a day, the Coalition's leadership received the final message from their strategists. Every major human fleet was converging, advancing on each of their home systems at speeds they had not prepared for. Ares was already burning towards Zorik's capital world. Iron Vanguard was splitting its forces between primary command hubs, systematically dismantling relay stations, wiping out entire sectors before communication could even be re-established. The Perseus initiative had already deployed ahead of the main assault, striking deep into coalition infrastructure. Their forces severed logistical lines, crippled intelligence networks, and dismantled defenses before any countermeasures could be executed. For all their talk about protecting the innocent, one of the counselors hissed, his voice laced with venom. "Now they strike at our home worlds." "Sir," an intelligence officer interrupted, his tone unusually stiff. "There have been no civilian casualties reported." The room went silent. "What?" Rhett's slit-pupiled eyes narrowed. Their home worlds were no longer a refuge, counselor. Rhett was the first to act. He called for an emergency meeting, gathering what remained of the coalition's ruling elite. His voice was sharp, demanding. His reptilian features coiled in tension as he addressed the assembled leadership. "They're coming faster than expected. We need to consolidate power now." Zorik, his luminous gaze colder than before, analyzed the reports. "No single system can hold them back. Not alone." Rhett's claws drummed against the war table. "Then we make our stand together." Silence stretched across the chamber. Zorik's mind worked through the possibilities. "You propose retreating from our home worlds." "We're not retreating," Rhett snapped. "We're repositioning. If we split our forces now, we'll be crushed separately. If we fall back to one stronghold, we force them into a direct confrontation." One of the other counselors, a strategist overseeing their fleet coordination, shifted uncomfortably. "Where do we fall back to?" Rhett's eyes narrowed. "Etherian." The room stiffened. Etherian, the most heavily fortified system under coalition control, a cluster of densely populated planets, military infrastructure embedded into its very core, shield networks that had withstood centuries of conflict. Zorik's head tilted slightly. "We force them into our strongest system, hoping the cost of civilian casualties will make them hesitate." Rhett's response was immediate. "It will make them hesitate." Zorik exhaled slowly, calculating the odds. "If they hesitate, we counterattack. We force them into a war of attrition. We break their momentum." The chamber murmured nods of agreement, rippling through the gathered leadership. The order was given. Every remaining fleet, every military asset not already destroyed was redirected to Etherian orbital stations, were reinforced planetary defenses brought online. Every sensor array, every artillery platform, every anti-ship battery powered up in preparation for war. The best commanders of the coalition took personal control of their defensive networks, ensuring that no weakness would go unnoticed. They turned the entire system into a fortress, believing that no force, no matter how large, could breach its defenses. Rhett watched the final projections, his voice tinged with forced satisfaction. "This will be the graveyard of their arrogance," he muttered, as if trying to convince himself. Zorik did not speak for a long time. He stared at the war table, the pulsating markers of human fleets moving with surgical formation. Something in the pattern unsettled him, but he buried it beneath the weight of logic. "They will break upon Etherian," he murmured, as if stating an undeniable truth. Across the void, the human war machine was already in motion, Aetherion loomed ahead, a fortress carved into the void, its planets encased in vast orbital rings, bristling with heavy weaponry. The system's defensive grid had been built over centuries, a vast web of sensor arrays, long-range artillery stations, and planetary shields, each designed to repel the unthinkable. The leaders of the coalition arrived in staggered waves, each retreating from their respective home worlds under the guise of strategic repositioning. In truth, it was fear that had driven them here. Rhett stood on the command deck of Jakir, the Coalition's primary war command, his claws gripping the railing as he watched their remaining fleets arrive. One by one, dreadnoughts, battlecruisers, and defensive carriers assumed strategic positions. "Begin full system lockdown." Rhett ordered, his voice betraying the weight pressing down on him. "I want every planetary defense platform on immediate standby. Mobilize all auxiliary forces. Pull reserves from deep space fleets." "We hold here." Zanuck, standing rigid near the central holotable, monitored the activation sequences. "All planetary shields are fully operational. Orbital defenses are cycling up. We have enough firepower to reduce any fleet to wreckage before they breach the inner orbits." Rhett's nostrils flared as he steadied himself. "Then they'll break against us like waves on rock. But even rock erodes." Deep within, Aetherion's tactical network, orders rippled outward, mobilizing war assets at an unprecedented scale. The planetary defense grids, synced battle stations locked onto every approach vector, and hypervelocity missile silos armed themselves in automated precision. The combined strength of the Coalition's remaining fleets gathered in the system's heart, their hulls gleaming under the cold light of Aetherion's twin stars. They were ready, or so they thought. On the bridge of the UHS Olympus, Kyle stood motionless, watching as data streams fed into the command interface. Reports confirmed what they already suspected. The Coalition leadership had gathered in Aetherion, pooling their remaining forces in a last-ditch attempt to make a stand. "They're cornered," Vor muttered, his eyes sweeping across the strategic readout. "Good saves us the trouble of hunting them down one by one." Thorn exhaled through his nose, arms crossed. "They'll fight." Hard, Kyle's gaze didn't waver. "It won't matter." A comm officer approached, nodding sharply before speaking. "Final fleet movements confirmed, sir. The Ares Armada is in position on the outer approach. Iron Vanguard and Sovereign Command are moving to encircle Perseus. Initiative has already begun infiltration protocols." Kale nodded, his voice calm. "Then we move." Across the vastness of space, the largest human war fleet in history surged forward. Aetherion's outermost sensor nets flickered, registering gravitational anomalies, hyperspace distortions, ripples of movement through the void. Coalition officers stationed across the defensive outposts watched in muted disbelief as their instruments struggled to comprehend what was unfolding. Then, reality snapped into focus. The human fleets materialized in a perfect, synchronized formation, each battle group sliding into pre-designated vectors with ruthless precision. The darkness of space became a tapestry of metallic giants, warships stretching beyond the horizon of planetary bodies. The Ares Armada formed a relentless vanguard, its dreadnoughts like moving citadels, their hulls marked with the scars of countless battles. Iron Vanguard moved in formation, flanking their approach with smaller, highly maneuverable destroyers, their weapons cycling through targeting solutions before their enemies could even react. The Perseus initiative remained unseen, somewhere buried in the cracks of the enemy's defenses, already orchestrating the inevitable downfall of Atharion's last hope. Aboard the Coalition's central war station, The command chamber fell into a suffocating silence. Zoric's gaze was fixed on the massive holographic display that projected real-time fleet movements. That can't be right, he murmured. Velkor's claws tapped against the console, his mind racing. How did they mobilize this many ships so fast? Before an answer could come, new alerts blared across Etherion's primary defense grid. Enemy fleet detected. Engagement imminent. The station trembled slightly as automated systems prepared to fire. Across the planetary rings, thousands of defense turrets pivoted, locking onto human warships. Missile silos, armed charge capacitors whined as railgun platforms aligned. The Coalition's final stronghold stood ready to erase anything that crossed into range. Then nothing happened. Velkor's frills flared in alarm. Why aren't the weapons firing? A junior officer scrambled across the command station, his voice laced with panic. "Sir, the systems." He hesitated, then forced the words out. "They've been overridden." A stillness settled across the chamber. Velkor turned slowly. "What did you say?" The officer's skin had gone pale, his fingers trembling over his console. "Sir, we're locked out. The weapons, they're unresponsive. Across the entire Etherian defense network, turrets sat motionless, missile bays remained sealed, and artillery platforms failed to cycle their fire sequences. The mighty fortress of the Coalition, their impenetrable bastion, was silent. Zoric's voice was a whisper of horror. "Impossible." From the UHS Olympus, Kale watched the data feeds confirming what they had planned. His eyes narrowed, his voice measured. So the damn thing actually worked. Vor smirked, shaking his head. "I'll be damned." Thorn leaned in slightly. "Do we tell them what we did?" Kyle considered it for a moment, then spoke evenly. "No. Aboard the Coalition war station." The leaders stared in disbelieving horror at their failing command systems. Frantic engineers attempted to regain control of their defense grid, but it was like grasping at smoke. Every override, every emergency reset failed. The humans had taken Etherian before a single shot had been fired. Rhett slammed his fist against the console. "Launch. The fleet's every ship." "We have." Zoric was silent, watching as human ships advanced without hesitation. Rhett turned to him, eyes blazing. "We cannot sit here like prey waiting to be butchered." Zoric blinked slowly, his gaze unreadable. Then with chilling calm, he gave the order. "All remaining fleets engage at full capacity. We fight across the void." The last great armada of the Coalition began to move. The battle erupted in full force. Coalition warships surged forward, their engines burning at maximum thrust as they moved to form a defensive perimeter around Etherian's core worlds. Hundreds of vessels from dreadnoughts to escort frigates maneuvered into position. Their hulls gleaming under the distant twin stars, fighter squadrons launched in waves, forming intricate formations as they prepared for interception. Throughout the void, weapons locked onto approaching human fleets, their targeting systems coldly efficient. Yet the humans did not slow. The Ares Armada led the charge, a formation of heavy warships, cutting through the darkness like a blade. The Iron Vanguard followed their cruisers and destroyers, slipping into flanking positions, forming an unbreakable wall of firepower. Sovereign Command, the fleet's strategic backbone, executed long-range bombardments, striking enemy formations before they could fully organize. From the command deck of the UHS Olympus, Kyle watched the battlefield, his face set like iron. Tactical overlays displayed every movement, every engagement, every attempt by the enemy to resist. The coalition was fighting for its survival, and yet from the very first engagement, the outcome had already been decided. Status report. Kyle commanded. Enemy fleet is engaging at full capacity. An officer responded. They're throwing everything they have at us. Vor leaned against the hollow table, arms crossed. They're desperate. Thorne smirked. It won't matter. As if on cue, a wave of human bombers carved through the enemy formation, weaving through anti-air fire like phantoms. They struck in perfect synchronization, targeting critical systems on the coalition capital ships. Explosions rippled through the void as reactors went critical, entire warships breaking apart in violent detonations. Along the coalition's command network, voices shouted in panic. They're inside our formations. We can't hold this perimeter. More ships breaking through. How are they bypassing our defenses? The answer was brutal in its simplicity. The humans fought with no regard for convention. They did not throw their forces into direct conflict, hoping to overwhelm with sheer numbers. Every movement was precise. Every strike calculated. The Perseus initiative, operating unseen, had already dismantled entire sectors of the enemy's command infrastructure before the battle had even begun. Their jamming systems disrupted communications. Their cyber warfare units severed command chains, and their stealth vessels hunted isolated ships with cold efficiency. The coalition's greatest mistake had been assuming the battle would be fought on their terms. It was not. Then Atharian's defenses roared to life. Beyond the planets and stations, missile silos unlocked, turrets swiveled, and planetary defense grids crackled as they came online. A storm of energy beams, railgun slugs, and torpedoes erupted from Atharian's fortifications. The sheer volume of fire, so overwhelming that for the briefest of moments, the sky itself burned. Velkor's eyes widened in stunned disbelief. The system reset. Our weapons are online. Zenak's grip tightened against the railing. Then we fight. Within the coalition fleet, a surge of defiant hope spread through the ranks. Their ships, battered but still standing, turned their guns toward the human armada. Tactical officers barked new orders. Weapon crews worked frantically to cycle their targeting systems, and formations realigned. Then aboard the UHS Olympus, Kael sighed, so it didn't last forever, Vor remarked dryly. Thorne smirked. Didn't need to. Kael's eyes never left the hollow table. We're already inside. They're already terrified, surging through the void. The incoming fire from Aetherian's defenses struck. The human fleet. Shields flared, kinetic barriers absorbed the first barrage, and hull plating groaned under the impact. But the formations did not break. The response was immediate. Merciless. The Ares Armada repositioned its dreadnoughts, turning broadside. An order flashed through the command network. Counterfire authorized. A moment later, the Ares warships unleashed hell. Their railguns, some the size of buildings, fired in staggered volleys, launching hyper-dense slugs that ripped through the void at near light speeds. The first shots shattered defensive stations, ripping through their hardened exteriors as if they were paper. The second volley targeted enemy warships, piercing shields and rupturing hulls in single catastrophic impacts. The Iron Vanguard moved next. Their destroyers executed high-speed maneuvers, slipping past the still realigning coalition formations, cutting through their ranks like scalpel blades. They did not target civilians. They spared infrastructure. They struck only at the enemy's military assets with a precision that left no room for error. Zorik watched in horror as his forces crumbled around him. "We can't hold this line," a commander screamed over the fleet-wide comms. "Then fall back," another shouted. Rhett's frills flared in rage. "Retreat. To where? There's nowhere left." Zorik turned toward him, something cold settling in his expression. "There's one place left." Rhett hesitated, then his eyes widened with realization. Ethereum's system was home to not just military assets, but also millions of civilians. Commercial spaceports, transit hubs, and interplanetary liners filled the traffic lanes. One such vessel, a high-capacity transport, had already been scheduled for departure before the battle began. Rhett turned to his aides. "Prepare a ship. We leave immediately." Zorik hesitated for only a fraction of a second before nodding. "Contact our remaining forces. They buy us time." Over the battlefield, coalition officers who had once fought with zeal suddenly found their orders changing. Their job was no longer to win. It was to stall. KL, watching the battlefield unfold, narrowed his eyes as enemy formations shifted. "They're repositioning an officer, reported pulling forces toward the inner system." Thorne frowned. "They're trying to make a last stand." Vor exhaled sharply. "No, they're covering a retreat." The battlefield over Etherian was no longer a war zone. It was a graveyard. The once proud fleets of the Coalition amassed in desperation were now nothing more than drifting wreckage. Human warships moved methodically through the debris field, finishing off what little resistance remained. Every battlecruiser, every destroyer, every last desperate fighter had been systematically eliminated. On the bridge of the UHS Olympus, Admiral, Kyle stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the final transmission from enemy vessels flicker and die. The last of their defenses had collapsed. The remnants of their forces were no longer an army, just dying embers of a force that had once considered itself superior. "They still have a few stragglers in low orbit," a tactical officer reported. "Handle them," Kale said simply. Through the void, Iron Vanguard squadrons launched their assault, eliminating the last remnants of resistance without error. The final remaining Coalition battleship, Zarka's Vow, had its engines disabled, its weapons neutralized. A boarding team secured the ship minutes later, taking what little crew had survived into custody. Kale turned to Admiral Thorne. "That's the last of them." Thorne nodded once, his expression unreadable. "No organized defense left. They're finished." A heavy silence settled between them. "They never thought we'd come this far," Admiral Vor murmured. Thorne let a cynical smile tug at his lips. "They thought we'd hesitate, that they could hide behind their people, behind their defenses." Kale's gaze darkened. "We didn't." Above Etherian's core planets, human warships held orbit. Not a single civilian had been harmed. The destruction had been absolute, but it was entirely military. The Coalition's final stronghold had been obliterated without a single innocent casualty. But this wasn't victory yet. "They're not here," Vor said grimly. Kale turned back to the holo display as intelligence reports from embedded operatives fed into the interface. Zorik and Rhett had already fled. "They abandoned their own fleets," Thorne muttered, shaking his head. "Cowards." Vor crossed his arms. "They knew Etherian would fall. They weren't planning to win, just to delay us long enough to escape." Kael studied the map, eyes sharp. "We already know where they went." A silent tension filled the bridge. Rennick, the lead intelligence officer, activated a secondary display. "We've tracked their escape route." They left Aetherion aboard a high-profile commercial vessel, Celestial Current. The transport was already scheduled to depart before the battle began. They used the civilian evacuation as cover. Thorn let out a short chuckle, shaking his head. They think hiding among civilians will save them. Kael's voice was steel. They're wrong. The room fell silent. Vor leaned forward. How long until they reach Nexus Terminal? 16 hours. Rennick confirmed. If they disembark there, we'll lose them in the neutral sectors. Kael didn't hesitate. Then we don't let them get that far. A calculated stillness settled over the war table. This was no longer a war. It was a hunt. Vor tapped a command into the interface. Deploy Ghost Squadron. Full stealth protocols. No signatures, no emissions. We surround the Celestial Current without them ever knowing we're there. Thorn nodded. We'll insert an infiltration team. Silent entry. No alarms. They won't even realize what's happening until it's already over. Kael's gaze hardened. We cut off their escape, isolate the targets, and take them alive. No collateral damage. Rennick hesitated. And the civilians? They won't even know we were there. Vor interrupted. Thorn smirked. Like ghosts. The orders were given. The hunt had begun. The Celestial Current drifted through the vast expanse of deep space, its sleek frame cutting through the darkness as its engines burned at a steady pace. Inside, passengers moved through its lavish corridors, some enjoying the amenities of the luxury transport, others confined to their private suites. On the lower decks, behind security-locked doors, two figures stood in silence. Zorik stared at the datapad in his hand, watching the latest encrypted updates from their few remaining contacts. His bioluminescent skin pulsed faintly, a subconscious display of tension. Rhett sat nearby, his reptilian fingers drumming against the armrest of a plush chair. His golden eyes flicked toward his counterpart. "You're worried?" Zorik's nostrils flared, a silent tell of his unease. "I don't like unknowns." We should have seen movement from the humans by now. Rhett's frills twitched. Perhaps they are still assessing Zorik's gaze. Darkened, or perhaps they've already made their move. The words hung in the air. Rhett shifted uncomfortably. The ship's security is sufficient. The crew is competent. If the humans come, we will know. Zorik wasn't convinced. He tapped the pad once more. But there was nothing. No reports of human fleets advancing. No signs of pursuit. Just silence. Trailing the Celestial Current, 3 human warships emerged from the darkness, silent, invisible. They moved in perfect formation, their hulls coated in advanced optical and electromagnetic cloaking fields. No sensor array, no passive scan, no automated security measure aboard the Celestial Current would register their presence. To the ship's passengers and crew, the illusion was flawless. They were alone, in the vast emptiness of space. Inside the lead warship, UES Phantom, the infiltration team was already in motion. Captain Cade adjusted his tactical visor, reviewing the schematics of the Celestial Current. His team, 6 elite operatives clad in adaptive stealth suits, stood ready in the drop bay. Their weapons were non-lethal. Their mission was precise. "This is a clean extraction," Miyavi murmured over the comms. "No alarms, no unnecessary contact. We isolate the targets, extract them, and vanish. If we do this right, the passengers won't even realize we were here." His visor pulsed green synchronized. "Approaching infiltration window," the pilot announced. The ship adjusted its trajectory, aligning perfectly with the celestial current's dorsal airlock. A soft hiss filled the bay as the docking mechanism engaged. Miyavi gave the signal. The security systems aboard the celestial current never had a chance to respond. Within seconds, Miyavi's team breached the airlock, slipping inside like shadows. Internal scanners, motion detectors, and biometric alarms were overridden before they had the opportunity to alert anyone. The ship's security personnel remained at their posts, unaware that 6 heavily trained operatives now moved undetected through their corridors. Miyavi led the way, moving like a shadow. His HUD displayed the projected paths of passengers and crew in real time, ensuring 0 encounters. They reached the lower decks in under 3 minutes. The target suite was ahead. Miyavi motioned, and his team fanned out. 2 operatives moved to disable the room's electronic locks. Another synchronized a tactical dampener to suppress outgoing transmissions. Miyavi instructed, his voice a whisper in the comms. "Prepare for breach." Inside the suite, Zorik felt it, the shift in the air, a presence unseen. His skin flared with warning. Then the door opened. Too smooth, too silent. His instincts screamed. This was not normal. Rhett barely had time to react before the darkness moved. Figures materialized, stepping forward in perfect timing. Zorik reached for his concealed weapon. A shock pulse struck his wrist. An invisible force seizing control of his nervous system. His body locked. Rhett roared, his claws unsheathing, but something cold pressed against the side of his skull. A voice steady and calm whispered in his ear, "Don't." The room was silent. The humans had already won. They just didn't realize it until now. The suite was silent. Zorik's limbs refused to move, his muscles locked by the shock pulse still coursing through his system. Rhett, on the other hand, was still conscious, though that was hardly an advantage. The cold pressure of a weapon against his skull ensured that any sudden movement would be his last. The figures in black armor had materialized from the shadows, their presence, a cold inevitability rather than a sudden intrusion. Their movements were mechanical, effortless, like specters weaving through the air itself. No words were spoken. There was no need. Rhett's eyes darted towards Zorik, searching for something. Perhaps an order, perhaps an escape. But the Zalari counselor could only stare ahead, his body unresponsive, his mind still catching up to the horrifying realization. It was over. One of the operatives pressed 2 fingers against a control pad on his wrist, triggering a command. The lights in the suite shimmered once. A brief pulse of interference. Throughout every deck of the celestial current, security feeds, looped biometric logs were overwritten, and all communications from this sector of the ship fell silent. Not a single passenger had noticed Rhett. Exhaled sharply, his reptilian frills pulsing in agitation. His voice was low, a forced growl. "You wouldn't dare kill us here, not in front of civilians." The operative beside him tilted his head slightly as if considering the statement. Then without hesitation, he drove the butt of his rifle into Rhett's gut. The Cathari counselor doubled over with a guttural wheeze, his body curling inward as the impact sent shockwaves of pain through his core. His claws scraped uselessly against the floor, his strength reduced to nothing beneath the trained precision of the strike. Zorik, his body still immobilized, could do nothing but watch. The lead operative, Captain Donny Miyavi, finally spoke, his voice devoid of malice, devoid of emotion, just an executioner delivering a sentence. "We're done," talking. The command was silent, relayed through the team's neural links, so the operatives shifted in perfect sync. Their motions practiced, methodical. Zorik and Rhett were hoisted to their feet, their struggling forms effortlessly subdued by the sheer efficiency of the human soldiers. Restraints locked into place, designed specifically to counteract any biological advantages their species might attempt to leverage. No struggle. Nowhere to run. Rhett gritted his fangs, his mind racing. There had to be something, some way to turn this in their favor. The ship was still in transit. There were still civilians aboard, and yet the realization struck him like a physical blow. The humans had already accounted for everything. His breathing grew ragged, fury battling against the suffocating weight of futility. "You don't even have the decency to gloat," he spat. No speech, no declaration of victory, no response. The operatives moved them toward the exit, their grip ironclad. Rhett struggled harder, his muscles flexing against the restraints. "We are leaders of the coalition," he snarled. "You will answer for this." Still nothing. A door unlocked. Only the faintest sound of the mechanism followed. The corridor outside was eerily still. The civilians continued about their routines, blissfully unaware that mere meters away, two of the most powerful figures in the galaxy were being erased from history. Rhett's eyes flicked toward Zanak, searching for something. Anything but the Zalari remained motionless, his expression devoid of defiance. A silent acceptance. He had seen the truth. There was no escape. The team moved swiftly, guiding their captives through the pre-cleared path toward the docking bay. Every step was premeditated. Every corridor they crossed had already been secured. If Rhett had hoped for a last-minute intervention for guards to rush in with weapons drawn for alarms to blare, nothing came. The celestial current continued its voyage, uninterrupted. The docking bay loomed ahead, the sealed airlock barely visible through the shadows. The lead operative signaled a silent go-ahead. The U.S. Phantom waited on the other side. The team guided the prisoners through the secured path. The airlock cycled open with a muted hiss, and within seconds, Zanak and Rhett were forced inside. There was no resistance, no way out. Then the transmission was sent. Mission accomplished. Captain Miyavi reported over the secure channel, targets secured. They're aboard the Phantom. On the UHS Olympus, the confirmation illuminated the command center's displays. Kale, Thorne, and Vor stood in silence, watching Thorne's smirk widened. And just like that, it's over. Vor crossed his arms, no speeches, no grand last stand, just two cowards dragged from their hole. Kale studied the mission logs, then he spoke. Not a single innocent harmed, not a single threat made, just taking out the trash. He turned to the crew, his voice calm. "We're done here." The transmission ended. The war was over. Two tyrants fell not with fire, but in silence, stripped of power, while the galaxy looked the other way. No civilians harmed, no alarms raised, just justice, quiet and clean. The war was over, and humanity had changed everything.